to another installment of the Foundation Patreon. I'm your guest lecturer, Modern Day James, and you might recognize me from my YouTube channel, where I teach young artists how to annoy strangers on the subway of New York City. In addition to that, the channel takes a structural approach to drawing, be it posing characters or understanding the differences between lens lengths. Because it's my belief that having full control of forms will allow you to draw anything in any perspective. But before we begin, a few pieces of shameless self-promotion. Starting this summer, I'll be teaching a dynamic sketching course at Brainstorm. In it, we'll cover how we can use 3D forms to deconstruct any object, and how we can use conscious decision-making to improve the quality of our line work. And if you enjoy what we're covering today, be sure to head over to youtube.com/moderndayjames to subscribe to the channel. So today I'm going to cover a few techniques that will be about generating and modifying primitive forms. We'll then put all these skills together and create the sketch that you're seeing here. All these techniques that I'm covering today are derived from the first few chapters of my book that's going to be released later this year. And now that that's all out of the way, let's get started with some dynamic sketching techniques. The main building blocks of dynamic sketching will be our basic primitive forms. This section might be reviewed for some of you, but I want to just go into this with a similar understanding between all of us. We're going to rely on the cube for pretty much everything. In this first part, we're going to use the cube to generate our other primitive forms, but once we're comfortable with that, we'll skip to a freehand version of those.
But in order to do that, we need to understand how to create ellipses in perspective. When we place a circle directly within a square, it touches the center point of each edge. If we subsequently turn that square in perspective, the same rule holds true. Only now, since one end is closer to the observer than the other, it will create a distorted shape known as an ellipse. Taking a look at the shape of all ellipses, one end will be shorter, known as the minor axis, and the other will be longer, known as the major axis. We'll come back to it in a little bit, but the minor axis will essentially be the angle of tilt for our ellipse. So now let's create our other primitive forms within this square. We can start by drawing through to the other edges on the opposite side, almost as if we're seeing through this form. I'll be drawing a cone here which has a circle for the base and then converges to a single point. Once again, that circle on the bottom face has to touch each of the 4 center points. This is why drawing the initial cube is helpful, because it guides you in your placement of the ellipse. The next primitive form we'll create is a cylinder, which is essentially 2 circles connected to one another. Once again, the circles have to touch each of the 4 center points on the perimeter lines. And once each of those are in place, I connect them together. These lines are placed as soon as the ellipse is tangent to the minor axis. The next primitive form we'll create is the sphere. Since a sphere will look like a perfect circle at any angle, we need to add some forms to it to make it appear as though it's 3-dimensional. So what I'm doing here is creating 2 perpendicular edge loops, or edges that wrap around our initial cube form. And within each of these, I'll create an ellipse. The minor axis of the yellow ellipse is going in perspective back towards the left vanishing point, and the minor axis of the green ellipse is vertical. Connecting these 2 ellipses together with a circle will create our sphere. Next, I'll show you a method for tilting boxes. I begin again with a cube that is drawn through to the opposite side. On the face closest to us, I create a rectangle that is tilted backwards. You can take each of these 4 vertices and connect them to the edges on the opposite face in order to extrude our 2-dimensional rectangular shape into a 3-dimensional rectangular prism. The final method of generating primitives that I'll show you is creating a custom shape and then extruding it in perspective. It's incredibly similar to the previous method that we just did, except now, instead of creating a rectangular form, we'll create one that's of our own design. Often, looking at a subject in an orthographic view can be incredibly insightful for creating it in perspective. Just like we did for tilting the ellipse in perspective, we'll create that same box, but now rotated. And in order for us to figure out where the vertices of this new shape will be placed, we'll create some measurements on the orthographic view. Notice that the bottom vertice is just right of center, as well as the 2 side vertices which are just below the center point as well. And now, having made these observations, I place in the shape on the tilted plane. Since perspective is going to distort the proportions of the shape, it's really helpful to make those observations. And now once again, we're just going to block out our cube form and then extrude that custom shape to the other side. Also notice I tend to ghost over my lines before drawing them in. You can use the straight line tool if you want, but I find that this gives a more organic, natural looking line. And I always like to take any opportunity to improve my draftsmanship where I can. It can really save a lot of time to use the shift-click option in Photoshop, but I think it yields results that are a little bit more stiff and less lively. Now, sometimes due to time constraints this can be necessary, so I don't want you to get the impression that using shift-click is in some way wrong, but I think improving your draftsmanship will pay off in the long run. Alright, so with that out of the way, let's discuss how we can take some of these primitive forms and modify them. It might seem like an oversimplification, but I assure you that everything can be boiled down into these primitive forms. And you'll notice that while I'm doing this, I'm not using any perspective grids. I think it's really important to do this without a grid because you need to develop that intuition, that ability to see in 3 dimensions. So the first modification of these primitive forms that I want to introduce you to is shearing. So essentially what we'll be doing here is taking a flat plane and cutting it through our form. I haven't sketched it in here, but essentially we're taking an angled plane and cleaving it directly through the form. Notice that by taking off the corner of that form, we've essentially turned one vertex into 3, and we've created a new 5-sided form. Now we'll repeat the process with the cone by taking the same flat plane and cleaving it through the cone. The resulting form will have a tilted ellipse for the top face. And now I'm repeating that process with the sphere. Notice that when I'm cleaving this cylinder, the plane goes beyond the top face. And as you can see, I've only cleaved off a segment of the top face. The second modification I'll be doing is bending these primitive forms. This is going to require us to use the tilting planes technique that I discussed earlier, as the resulting faces will be at different angles from one another. The act of bending will stretch out one side and it will compress another. As a result of this, you get the bunching of material underneath on the folded inside. You'll see this a lot in everyday life, in certain things like the folding of clothes. And again, I'm doing this while keeping perspective in mind, but I'm not being so rigid that it's stopping me from keeping my lines fluid. You might feel more comfortable having a perspective grid in place, but they do have a tendency to stifle the drawing and limit your understanding of perspective. And now we'll extrude shapes, similar to how we did before. I'm not really drawing through too much, mostly for presentation's sake. So if you find yourself needing to place in the guidelines and drawing through, by all means go ahead and do that. Extruding forms from these rounded primitives is a little bit more difficult, because where it connects back to the original primitive is curving away from it. Heavier line weight helps separate out overlapping forms, and I usually place it on lines that are in shadow as well. The final modification that I'll cover today is beveling, which is essentially taking one edge and converting it into 2. I'll skip the sphere since there are no edges at all to be beveled. And then we can flatten the top and bottom edges on a cylinder. But what happens when we want to place objects at various angles within the same scene? As we know, not all objects in everyday life are parallel to one another, so we're going to have to devise some methods to figure this out. My first step is creating a cylinder in perspective, and I do that by creating a flat plane, finding the 4 center points of the perimeter line, and creating an ellipse within it. Notice how slowly I draw this ellipse. It might seem painstakingly slow or might feel like pulling teeth, but I assure you that it's faster in the end if you can do it right the first time. Now I'm extruding that top square down, and I'm adding a bit of vertical convergence just for preference sake. Now I finish drawing in the bottom face. And then within it, I create another ellipse. Now I'm going to draw a series of boxes that will be rotating around the center axis of the cylinder. Since we know that boxes are always going to have 90-degree or perpendicular angles, I draw in clock markings on the top cylinder face, because I know that the distance between the two lines is always going to be 3 hours. For example, if I create a box with a length line at 12, its width is going to be at 3 o'clock. The same rule will hold true as we continue to rotate throughout the entirety of the clock. But since this clock has been established in perspective, the forms that we create will also be in perspective. Alright, so now let's start placing in our forms. I start with a line going to 4 o'clock, line A. Line A connects to the top center of the cylinder, which I then connect down to the bottom center of the cylinder. Since our length, A and B, is headed towards 4 o'clock, we know that the width line must go to 1 o'clock. And in order to figure out where the second line heading towards that right vanishing point will be, we imagine ourselves drawing a line all the way back towards that vanishing point, which is off the page, and then drawing another line all the way back to that vertice at 4 o'clock. We can do the same thing to figure out where the placement of our other lines are by extending them all the way back to the left vanishing point in our mind, and then drawing from the left vanishing point through that far vertice at 1 o'clock. I'm working counterclockwise here, so I'm going to repeat the same process, but now our line A is at 3 o'clock as opposed to 4. We're rotating around that center edge, so that stays put. One thing that you can see is that that right vanishing point has moved so close to center that it's merged with the center vanishing point. The left vanishing point has moved further into the periphery. And this rule will hold true as well. As one vanishing point moves closer to the center, the other will move further and further into the periphery. and so we'll do the process once again, taking all the same steps as we did previously. I know this process can seem a bit repetitive and is very painstaking, but it's very helpful to go through all the steps of this exercise and then maybe try repeating it once again without any guidelines. Alright, give yourself a pat on the back because we've done more geometry than a 9th grade math class.
When drawing with lines, it's useful to use a variety of widths or line weights to your work. Lighter lines are useful for edges that are in highlight, while heavier lines are useful for indicating an edge that's in shadow or demonstrating overlapping. Notice how on this prism, I use heavier line weight towards the bottom. Since the most common lighting scenario is top lighting, as with sunlight or overhead lights, I tend to reserve these thicker lines for the bottom. I've discussed some draftsmanship exercises in previous videos, but a helpful exercise in improving your line work is creating 3 dots and connecting them in one smooth curve. Remember that when viewed head-on, a perfect circle placed within a square will touch the center of each edge. When we take that same plane and now tilt it in perspective, once again the circle needs to touch the center of each edge. The minor axis, drawn in red, will divide the ellipse along the shortest path and will head towards the vanishing point opposite of the plane. If we take this plane and tilt it forward along an elliptical path, we can create a new tilted plane in which to create an ellipse. The minor axis of this new ellipse is the tangent line of the elliptical path and the tilted plane. We can use these same principles to establish perspective in organic forms. In this first example, we can tell that the camera is positioned above the object because each ellipse curves downwards. Imagine that we're taking many paper-thin slices through this form, and then sticking a pin through the center of each one. And in the second example, each ellipse is curving upwards, which indicates that the camera is positioned below. As I've mentioned before, there are several different types of lines. Contour lines, which are typically light in line weight and indicate a shift in plane. Hatching lines, which are used to create texture and value. And the heaviest lines are reserved for indicating when one object is in front of the other and when planes are in shadow. Amundsen will often use a great deal of hatching and heavy line weight to indicate cast shadows, which are the shadows projected when an object occludes incoming light. Each of the primitive forms will project a different shadow shape. This isn't a rendering tutorial, so I'm not going to go too much into specifics, but there's a few key considerations when determining the size and placement of your shadows. The first is the angle of light shining on the object. The second is the distance to the light source, and the third being the quality or type of light that's being shown. But we'll get more into that later. Since hatching is our main tool to demonstrate value with lines, we can use it to indicate our lighting conditions, materials, and textures. A matte surface, like the one I'm sketching here, is non-reflective and will disperse the light through its surface. The area of darkest value is known as the core shadow, and surprisingly, it's not located closest to the ground plane, because those areas are receiving light reflected from the ground surface. The location at which the shadow ends is known as the terminator. This is the point where you're going to see the most texture. A fully reflective material like chrome will project its surroundings on its surface. The dark spot on the bottom is its reflection of its own cast shadow. Chainmail has a lot of fine details, but it's still subject to lighting like a matte surface. So I begin by hatching in some values. Once I have some tone set in place, I use a series of C-shaped curves traveling along an elliptical path to demonstrate the texture. The eyeball reflects a lot of light because of its specularity, but it's still subject to some matte shading properties. There's a lot of overlapping forms and feathers, so I use a heavy line weight to indicate those cast shadows. Adding in some hatching, or even cross-hatching, indicates the values and also adds some texture to these feathers. And try to remain cognizant of directionality when you're hatching. You can make your lines parallel or convergent, but don't make them aimless and arbitrary. Since the ram horn is essentially a spiraling rectangular prism, I add in hatching on one side to indicate the plane shift. Notice how I use a heavy line weight on those overlapping forms to indicate that one is in front of the other. Notice that I leave a lot of rest areas in the ridges that are in highlight. So let's try to tie both of these things together, our understanding of structure and form, and line quality. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking a look at a subject, in this case a vulture, and I'm trying to break it down into primitive forms. I'm using this red box to make certain measurements. I surround the entirety of the subject, divide that box into two, and then I create smaller custom shapes corresponding to the rib cage, pelvis, and skull. The reason why I choose these three is because for most organic subjects, these will be the points of rotation and movement. The surrounding red box and orange lines will help us place these three custom shapes that we've made in perspective later on. So now we'll take the same shapes, but we'll extrude them in perspective. I'm going to use a lot of guidelines with this first initial blockout, but then we'll do a subsequent blockout without any of these extra guidelines. So I start by making that same red plane that I had in the previous orthographic example, and dividing it accordingly. As you can see, I'm dividing along the center lines. These will help me figure out the placement of our shapes. Just creating a ground plane here. So as you can see, I can use the orthographic blockout to figure out where I'm going to place these shapes in perspective. I'll then use these flat shapes as the center line, which we can then extrude. The benefit of doing the orthographic blockout is that you can make some observations like, oh, this pelvis takes place in the bottom left corner, or the skull is at the top right corner. Now I'm going to take these shapes and I'm going to use them as a center line and extrude both to the left and to the right. It might look kind of strange and unlike the subject at this point, but I assure you that using these sorts of blockouts will really help you when you decide to create your own custom perspectives. It's a lot easier to copy a subject in the same perspective as a photo, but turning it in perspective like this is a lot more confusing, and sometimes simplifying to these blockouts makes it a lot easier. And then I extrude a tube for the neck. And that's going to rely on my knowledge of organic forms and ellipses. So now we'll repeat the same exact process, but we won't use any of these guidelines that we did here. Just taking those three-dimensional forms and trying to replicate them in the same perspective. Keep in mind the proportions that we've already established. And it's okay if our blockouts aren't exact replicas or they're not the exact proportions. We can always break away from them with our final line drawing. I oftentimes think students will get a little too bogged down by the primitive blockouts, so that can be one of the dangers of them. But if you allow yourself to just use them as a guide and you don't feel restrained by them, they can be extremely helpful. Here I'm making an ellipse where the neck meets the rib cage. Then I create a path that I'll use several ellipses to flesh out the volume for. Keep in mind the minor axis of these ellipses and how it's going to change with the tilt of the neck. And then I connect the perimeter of all these back to finalize that form. Alright, now I'm going to use that same block out, but I'm going to do my final lines over it. With these final lines, we'll keep in mind all the line drawing techniques we discussed previously. These texture lines that I'm indicating here for the neck feathers serve two purposes. They help flesh out what the volume is going to be, while also indicating what that material is. Those heavy cast shadows underneath those neck feathers again show that there's some volume there. It's a bit of a misconception to think that all we're trying to do with line drawing is capture silhouette. Yes, shape is obviously a very big component of it, but probably the second most important factor is the lighting conditions. So if we're experiencing top lighting, we really want to have those thick lines underneath. So much of line drawing is about indicating where the light is coming from. Here I'm indicating some feather shapes, adding heavier cast shadows underneath to show that it has some volume to it. Wrapping lines on the top of the wing. I do jump around quite a bit, mostly because I want to try to flesh out all different areas and figure out where everything is located. Then once I have everything in place, I'll start adding in more texture and lighting. You can see though that I'm already really breaking out of that primitive form quite a bit, but it has helped me figure out where everything's going to be. It's important to consider anytime you're drawing something that's a furry animal or has a lot of feathers like a bird, that a lot of the forms are obstructed by the volumes of the feathers and the fur. Also, those forms appear a lot rounder than they would had there been no feathers or fur. Here I use a lighter line weight for the top of the feet and darken up the bottom lines. I add some wrapping lines to show the volume and texture on the toes. Here's the tail feathers that are coming and poking through the back there. I'm adding a lot of texture on those legs because of the scales that would be there. Here I'm adding some value to the feathers, just using some hatching lines to indicate that. Now more wrapping lines on that far wing and wrapping lines on the close wing. And the cast shadow of the wing onto the torso. Here I'm vignetting some of the feathers, just adding in those shapes to make it look interesting. A lot of line drawing is balance of detail. You don't want to add too much or leave it too blank. Now that the forms are pretty much fleshed out, I just get rid of that blackout underneath. As you can see, we get a pretty cool looking sketch now with the help of those guidelines underneath. And the benefit of doing it this way is that you can continue to turn these primitive forms in any different angle, and it's a lot easier than starting with these finalized lines. The fifth step to this process would be to start with your final lines as opposed to using the blockouts. But I'll leave that for you guys to do on your own. Here I'm starting to add in some value on the feathers on the neck. I personally enjoy the effect that it has. The wrapping lines on the beak help indicate the value as well as show the volume of the form.
Alright, now that that sketch is done, I'll do an environment sketch that will call upon all the techniques we've developed thus far. I begin by blocking in some flat planes for the walls and floors.
Notice that even at this early stage, I've already called upon the plane rotation exercise that we did earlier. I'm using a pretty light line weight for all of these. This is because I'm eventually going to draw in my final details in a heavier line weight. What'll happen as we start placing in our final, heavier line weight details is that these initial guidelines will start to disappear visually. Here I'm ghosting over, pretending I'm connecting back to the horizon line to see where that second vanishing point will be, much like we did in the exercise before with the rotations. One thing that's really good about doing things digitally is that instead of ghosting in, you can actually draw in the line and just undo it if it doesn't work. And I'm using a tablet without a display, so there's going to be a little bit of undoing that happens here and there. Here I'm extruding back into the wall for a window shape. You have to make sure that that window has 3 dimensions to it. It can be easy for students to miss the minor details and the extrusions that happen, but there really is a lot of detail even in something as simple as a window. Take note of the connection points and the hinges, and decide how you're going to simplify those. Also, you can see in this environment that pretty much every item so far is at a different angle. Repeat the rotation exercise as much as possible till you feel comfortable doing this. Items like the plates and the knives on the tables really make the house more believable. A lot of these little props that I'm placing along the sides make the house feel as though it's lived in, which is something that's really important anytime that you're trying to make an environment. You want to make it feel as though someone has been living there. A location in which all the items are placed parallel to one another seems too organized and doesn't have the natural disorder that would occur from living in there. Here I'm just creating some items and things that would be hanging from the windows. I'm using very light line weight throughout all of this because we're going to commit to the final details a bit later on. I just want to figure out where everything is going to be placed. The mantles are good too because you can place a lot of details and show what items they would have lying around. I wanted to have this kitchen table at a slant because I wanted it to seem as though they had just finished dinner or something and the table got shoved. Maybe the table got pushed while they were eating, and now it's out of position. I didn't include it, but maybe something like a knocked over plate or cup or candle would help sell that point as well. You can see I'm really not going into too much detail on these small objects that are here on the table, but I'm just indicating where they are, indicating their placement and shape. And be sure to look at reference photos while you're doing this. I was looking at some old medieval style houses and seeing the sort of props and details that would be lying around the room. Also think about what the modern equivalent would be. What sort of things would you have in your own kitchen? Here's some cookware that's hanging from a rack. Bags of flour and rice to the side. Again, once you have your primitive geometry in, it's pretty easy to add these minor details in afterwards. Now it's just simply placing things around the room and making it look like it's a real place. Now I'm going to place in some stools at different angles, again to make it look like somebody just carelessly left and didn't place it back in its proper order. I'm using that same rotation method that I did earlier, always measuring back to the imaginary vanishing point that's off the page. Also notice that I'm drawing through a lot of the time. That's so I know where everything is interacting with one another. If two objects are meeting on the ground plane, then that means they're either in contact with each other or they're overlapping too much. And here you can see me, I'm starting to put in that heavier line weight to show in my final details. Adding some hatching for texture. I'm not going too much into lighting, but I'm adding some minor cast shadows to show some three-dimensionality to it. Some hatching lines to show that the table is made of wood. I like to use those heavy cast shadows. Fleshing out some of these cups and pots. I want to indicate that these beams are wood, so I just hatched them all the way through. You can do the wood texture in a different way if you want. You can indicate some of the wood grain. I just chose to use some vertical hatching for that. Loosely indicating some things that are resting on the mantle. I don't actually know what they are, it doesn't even really matter. You can always do a call out if you want to indicate anything in more detail. Also notice that on any line that's in shadow, I'm using a heavier line weight, so the bottom of these drawers are getting a heavier line weight. And the bending of these shadows really help indicate that things are touching one another. Here I'm picking up the lines underneath the table. There's a lot of small details in the legs of the tables that I'm just simplifying to basic forms. Again, anytime you have something that's in shadow or a plane that's occluded from some light, it's always nice to add some hatching to just make it appear more visually appealing. And you can also do some minor material indications, show that certain things are reflective by adding strong highlights. I'll discuss textures in a future video because I think it's a really important subject, and it makes your line drawings appear much more lively. I placed in these rock textures in a pretty light line weight. Using a combination of shapes and hatching, you can really flesh out a texture pretty accurately. One thing I want to note is that at each corner I'm filling it up with props. This makes the environment look less boring. 90-degree angles are somewhat stifling and lifeless. Again, those cast shadows blocking the light that would be hitting the wall shows that it's right next to it. Adding in some cracks for the stones on the wall. And here I'm just adding in some volume for the actual structure. Here I'm finishing up the hatching of the stonework. Make sure that everything follows that primitive geometry. And the hatching underneath this bench that's interrupted by the table helps emphasize the fact that the table is in front of it. Here once again, now I'm filling up those corners just to stop that 90-degree angle from being so prominent. You can add little patterns and bevelings on the chairs. It makes it appear as though there's some craftsmanship put into each prop. I'm using a lot of this hatching to indicate some material differences and maybe sometimes color differences. Elements like having the stairs going down to an area that we actually can't see, I think it adds a little bit of mystery and makes you want to explore that location a bit more. Notice how textures and things of lower prominence are done in a much lighter line weight, like the stones on the floor. I don't want them to be the thing that jumps out at you, so I just loosely indicate them. Things like the picture frames on the wall are good because it makes you think of what sort of pictures you would have on your own home. I decided last minute that I was going to fill in that dark space underneath there with just a heavy black. I feel like it sells the contrast a little bit more. I might be overworking this sketch at this point, but you have to make that decision for yourself. I think if I was going to go back and do this, I'd definitely make some changes. Maybe clean up some of the lines, or maybe not add in so much detail on the floor. But that's up to you. And you can also take a sketch like this and then paint over it if you really feel like it. Alright guys, that's pretty much it for me. I'll be back again next month with a tutorial on using different camera lenses in our drawings. So try these exercises out for yourself, and maybe try designing your own environment. Hope you guys enjoyed that video, and if you'd like some more content like that, be sure to head over to my YouTube channel at youtube.com/moderndayjames. Thanks again, everybody.